What's up again, everybody? We are bringing you some Lorcana gameplay. I'm Steven, and I'm hanging out with Brendan Patrick of Podcana fame. How's it going, Brendan?
Very good, Steven. Thank you for having me. Happy we get to commentate over this game that we played a couple days ago. I watched it back today, and I didn't realize at the time how just sick of a game it was. It was super close, and I feel like we get to see the essence of both decks on each side with this Sapphire Steel combo deck, and then you on the Ruby Amethyst Hyper Control.
Yes, indeed. You very graciously built these decks and lended me the probably the best deck in the format, perhaps, arguably the best deck in the format. And I was all too happy to play it because it is one deck that I actually have played a decent bit of. You've been grinding a lot, I hear, on both Pixelborn and in paper. Is that right?
Yep. Honestly, I just love the game at this point. It's probably one of the best constructed card games that I've ever played. Just this chapter 1 constructed season is just phenomenal. It's extremely well balanced, tons of decks to play. There might be a best deck, but I would say it's very debatable. And there's very, very good decks in different archetypes. So there's a good aggro deck, there's a good mid-range deck, and there's a great control deck as well. So you can really play whatever speaks to you in this format. The decks that we're playing here, like I mentioned, are Sapphire Steel sort of combo ramp, and then the Ruby Amethyst Hyper Control, which at this point is seen as the best deck in the format. And it might sound like that's sort of a default right now, but I'll tell you, 2 weeks ago, people were saying that Amber Steel was the best deck in the format. So this meta is still evolving and is still very dynamic.
I think you're 100% correct, and I think it is easy to say that this deck is the best deck in the format, but then you compare it to a lot of other great decks, like you mentioned, Amber Steel, and I think there's several other decks that we could sit here and talk about as the game gets going, but it's really tough to pin down one because the meta, like you said, is so playable, and I know I've been having a lot of fun with a variety of different decks. As you kick us off on sort of turn 2, I would say, with a wonderful little draw and basically sort of like a pseudo opt. You're going to get to put one of those cards in your hand and the other to the bottom of your deck.
Yep, this card is basically in the deck just to dig for combo pieces. So I just want to go back a little bit to my mulligan. So basically with this deck, you mulligan for a whole new world and some sort of ramp cards. I didn't really have any ramp cards in my opening hand, but I did have a whole new world. So you saw me mulligan 5 cards away, and I drew an extremely good hand off the back of that. So multiple ramp cards to go with that whole new world. A Fishbone Quill to help me ramp faster as well. So off to a good start. And the mulligan with the Sapphire Steel deck is pretty simple, at least in a vacuum, right? Lorcana is definitely a game where you are very sort of incentivized to mulligan based off your opponent's archetype, but in game 1 you don't know that, so it's very simple. Really just go for a whole new world and whatever ramp you can get.
Well, and you bring up a very good point. So to set the stage a little bit more, we actually did talk beforehand about what these decks are. We played very casually, so knowing what your opponent is actually playing is a huge advantage when you're going into that mulligan scenario, because you can kind of really sculpt your hand, or at least you can try to sculpt your hand in a way that plays well against their deck. And knowing that you were playing a combo deck, I was looking for ways that I could just go fast, get on the board quickly, and start trying to pressure that 20 lore win condition, while also having perhaps some answers to the big combo pieces you might be throwing down.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that that's a correct approach, right? My deck really doesn't do anything unfair until about 10 lore, and I can start dropping those bells, which quest for 5. Up until then, I'm just executing sort of a solitaire-esque game plan, trying to ramp, trying to play a whole new world, and get up to that critical amount of lore, and then you will actually start to see me enact the deck's game plan. So I think committing to the board early, trying to get aggressive as Ruby Amethyst is correct in this matchup. It's also important to consider when you see a deck like Sapphire Steel playing Ruby Amethyst, you have to be considering that whole new world, because Ruby Amethyst does draw a lot of cards, and sometimes you are given decisions whether to draw or to play your hand out onto the board, right? To go for card advantage or to play onto the board. You definitely want to play more onto the board against a deck that could potentially a whole new world you, because if you spend turn 4 maybe casting or cashing in your magic mirror for drawing a card, and then your opponent just whole new worlds you on turn 5, you effectively lose value. So you always got to keep that threat in mind.
That's exactly right. Here playing the Pongo, my thought being, well, if I can stick evasive and just other pesky characters onto the board, understanding that in order to clear those, you're going to have to expend resources from hand, things like Smash, or fire the cannons in concert with something like a Tinkerbell here that deals 1 to my side of the board. It's going to make it a little harder for you to just kind of easily clear. And here you are playing the Tinkerbell down, a very fantastic card, and there's the Let It Go being inked alongside of it.
Yeah, so I inked the Let It Go because I'm basically planning to play a whole new world, which is the last card in my hand. So just dumping my hand using the Fishbone Quill on my sort of one ink for turn here. And in terms of the Tinkerbell, honestly, just getting it out into the board, pressuring. It basically says you can't quest the Maleficent because if you do, I will kill it and then kill your Pongo off the back of the activation on the trigger. Pretty standard game plan from me. You go ahead and turn 5 Dragonfire. Obviously, it's a decent,
as you do.
it's a decent trade, but honestly, it's okay because I do have access to that whole new world. It's going to go ahead and make you discard your hand and go and refill mine now that I am at 8 lore here.
Yeah, I was actually hoping that you'd play some sort of a threat so that I can make use of that Dragonfire, assuming that you'd be starting the sort of chain of whole new worlds here in the next few turns. I was hoping to stick this board, make it a little tough for you to clear effectively, and kind of force me into getting rid of these value cards. And you did at a great time, because as we were ramping up, we had Elsa, we had a couple of other big hitters in the hand that we had to get rid of and draw into something brand new.
Yeah, this matchup's pretty interesting from the Sapphire Steel perspective because a whole new world does benefit a deck like Amber Amethyst so much, right? Because it, especially as we go into the late game, as the Amber's Amethyst player gets more ink onto the board, that whole new world can be pretty dangerous because, for the most part, your cards are more valuable than mine, right? You have the big Elsas, you have Be Prepared. Like, a lot of my cards are pretty bad, the ramp cards. So I basically have to sort of play around your top end, and to do that, I'm gonna have to play things out like the Bell now threatening 5 lore, try to get you to commit some of that removal, and sort of attrition you out of those premium removals, and then eventually quest to 20.
Yeah, and I was looking at my hand, and I had a couple of different options here. I could play the Maui that has Reckless, but it doesn't allow me to pressure that 20 lore win condition. What does is playing out this Jafar and Magic Mirror line, because it gives me an item on the board that could provide incremental value over time. But it also gives me another 2 lore quester on the board that has a fantastic removal option as well. So playing those out and trying to establish that onto the board, and then, of course, questing and passing on over. Understanding that the more times and the more opportunities I am able to play down things, the more capable I am of just saying Pongo can go quest and Maleficent can go quest.
Yeah, and I'm playing Sapphire Steel, so it's not super easy for me to clear your board. I don't have access to cards like Be Prepared, like in Ruby. I do have access to things like Grab Your Swords, which is sort of a pseudo AoE board clear, but ultimately my board clears are pretty inefficient. So pressuring the lore early like this is going to give you a big advantage, especially as we get into the late game. Even if I do end up clearing your board, getting ahead, you can threaten me with things like Ursula, which can come down, and maybe you're at your 15 lore, you're at 17 lore, and now I'm having to answer that question sort of every single turn because you're threatening this lethal. It's a lot of pressure for my deck to deal with.
And it's traditionally not something that you would necessarily pin on the Amethyst Ruby deck, because usually they are playing the more control plan. But when you're playing against a combo deck that can quest for like 5 lore out of nowhere with Bell, all of a sudden you do have to play a bit different. And it's really fun to watch this play out and to kind of reminisce back on how this game continues to play out, because the deck is playing sort of opposite in a way of what it normally wants to do.
I just want to notice why I used to smash on the Gaston instead of the Pongo. The Pongo's applying a lot more lower pressure, but ultimately, I'm sort of ahead on board if I can get this beast to trade in favorably, or at least 2 for 1 your board state here. And you're faced with a position where you have to answer this Bell, and that is something that Gaston does. Gaston does answer the Bell, and at this point, I believe you don't have enough cards in hand where your Jafar actually would hurt me enough. So Ursula, by the way, when it does come down on turn 7. If the opponent does not have any lore, it does not draw the card. That is a conditional draw effect there.
Yep, and that was kind of a funny little play. But I played Ursula. I considered Ursula versus something else, and I ended up playing Ursula because it is a 3 lore quester, and it allows me to just get another threat that has a huge body on the board and can quest for 3 lore consistently.
100%. It's also an uninkable, so you can't just let it sit in your hand and rot in your hand. So now we're seeing sort of the effectiveness of having access to as much lore as I do. I'm going to cast double Let It Go here and ultimately wipe the board. with the grab your swords off the back of this, I think. Oh no, actually just trade in.
Yeah, you should just be able to kind of trade effectively and efficiently here.
And then actually quest with my bell after I killed that Maleficent. And then we get to that scenario that I was sort of planning for the turn before because I did have both Let It Goes in my hand. So now my beast trades 2 for 1 on your board effectively. Although the Pongo is questing, my bell is threatening 5 per turn. So I'm in a pretty good spot here as the Amber Steel player, or sorry, the Sapphire Steel player.
Yep, indeed. And not only that, you followed up with Fishbone Quill to continue to sink things in. It's interesting, too, because, like, at a certain point with certain decks, you just cap out on what you're putting into the inkwell. You really stop inking in favor of holding cards that can perhaps swing the board state. But with this deck, you're more than happy. In fact, with both decks, you're more than happy just building up that ink base more and more to make these huge blowout plays in the late game.
Mm-hmm. And you really got to mitigate your sort of exposure to a whole new world. If you're keeping cards back, you don't want to make you discard like 5 cards, and I'm drawing 7, and you're drawing 7. I mean, that's just a huge swing on card advantage. Right now, so the reason why I inked that last card was to get access to my Beast Mirror, which is sort of my only draw engine at this point. And that's sort of the logic behind that. Beast Mirror is conditional on me having 0 cards in hand, and I need to sort of have that active so I can start drawing and digging to a whole new world, because a whole new world is critical to me sort of getting back into this game and drawing more bells and pressuring the lore even more.
Yeah, I was really fortuitous to have held onto that Maleficent for the past few turns after that whole new world draw, because it allows me in a pinch when you've taken a lot more control of the state on the board to remove that very dangerous 5 lore quester in Bell.
Mm-hmm. And now you see why cards like Pick Your Brain are in the deck. I mean, the card really doesn't do too much. It's an inkable card, but it does help you dig for your combo pieces. And at this stage of the game, the only card I really need to find is a whole new world.
I personally love Develop Your Brain. I think it's a fantastic card in general. It just helps you find what you need, as you know, but it also, the fact that it's a 1-cost inkable card is so underratedly good when you end up drawing it early game, or decide to keep it early game because you want to establish a quick early ink presence.
Just want to point out that I decided to sing a whole new world rather than cast that. I did that because I'm sort of behind on the lore race here. You're at 14. You're threatening 4 each turn. My beast is not going to be able to trade favorably anyway. And if you actually kill my Maleficent with your beast in combat, that's fine for me. Honestly, I would rather you kill my beast, which has 2 damage counters on it, than you quest for 2 more lore and get up to 16 lore.
Yeah.
So that's why I decided to sing a whole new world with beast rather than cast for 5. This Robin Hood, obviously off the whole new world, I'm going to be able to draw a card after it because I've already dumped multiple cards out of my hand, and you still have the 7 cards from a whole new world, and I'm able to go ahead and get that draw effect.
I think what you're also doing here on this just massive turn really shows why it's better in this scenario to sing the whole new world, simply because you've left all of your resources up, allowing you to draw into the 7, like you said, but then also just jam down a bunch of either threats or tools that you need to kind of stabilize. And here, as we kind of move ahead a little bit, I play a Pongo and then ink a Friends on the other side. I thought about holding that Friends on the other side, but understanding that the card draw in this matchup is so really dependent upon what you're going to be throwing at me. At this point, I just need to use the cards that I have. And in here, instead of just playing something that draws me 2 cards, I play a board state card in the form of Maleficent that draws me 1 card. So I'm still getting a card draw while also putting something on the board and hopefully threatening you over the next 2 turns to just win on the board.
Mm-hmm. I've been just committing multiple items, sort of persistent advantage as we progress through this game. I maybe make you discard again. It's just anything, sticking anything to the board is advantageous for you at this point. And you're probably holding back things like Be Prepared in case I start dropping those bells.
That's exactly right. So I think I've seen at least 1 Be Prepared up to this point. I may have drawn into a second Be Prepared, but when I have the board advantage, I'm not going to ever play it. And then I'm really going to wait until I can get some amount of just max value after you've committed to it and tried to trade down, especially when I'm at a lore advantage. And just keep in mind, if you're watching this at home, just like maybe picking up the game for the first time, trying to get into it, the game fundamentally is a race, and you working your way to a win really is predicated upon building that board and then building a lore advantage. And you absolutely murdered the board with 2 Grab Your Swords back to back. And that's the power of just a lot of ink, isn't it?
A lot of ink and a lot of new cards. So I did a lot on this turn, but I kind of shortcutted the combat of it. Basically, I cast double grab your swords by singing one with the Robin Hood there. I traded my beast, which already had two counters, into the Maleficent. Ultimately, we clear the board. I cast one grab your swords with my ink that was available, and I get down to those 0 cards, which is critical because I have two beast mirrors available. I commit to the board, and I know the Be Prepared is a threat, likely something you're holding it back, but it's totally fine because I have access to a double draw engine as we go back to my turn, and I'm effectively attritioning you out of those resources, right? So if I land another bell, it's much less likely to have another Be Prepared, and especially as you play out your hand here, which is funny because these are very unassuming characters, but they do a lot of work. So
They
I do
do.
talk. I do want to point something out here, Steven, because this is actually a very critical moment in the game. I top deck a whole new world. Looks really good. Looks really good, right? Actually, probably the card I wanted to see the least. Because you quested so aggressively in the early to mid game, and you're at 16 lore. It makes it so I have to play a whole new world basically, and not fishbone quote away, because I have to find an answer to these two one inkables, or sorry, one questers on the board, because they are going to win the game for you. But in any other scenario where one, you hadn't quested as much through the earlier mid game, and two, I had maybe not drawn a whole new world, I would have been totally happy activating my two beast mirrors, drawing 2 cards a turn, because you on the other side, as the Ruby Amethyst player, have access to no draw engine. I believe you had
Yeah.
1 card in hand at that point with two tutus on the board. That was
Yep.
a good state for me. So I had to playing this whole new world was very risky for me, because I just put you, the Ruby Amethyst player, with I think 9 or 10 ink at this point. I gave you a whole new hand, but I had to, because these two tutus were going to win the game.
Yep, over the next 2 turns. And that's why I chose to play them out in that way, because yes, there is some amount of removal options that you can draw into off of both beast mirrors. But if you don't have those, if you don't find those answers, then over the next 2 turns, I win the game. And I basically am just asking you if you have it. And in that moment, you did have a way to draw into, a new hand and possibly some new answers. But in this case, it helped me draw from my 2-card hand into a full-on 7-card hand. But this is a great scary answer. And if this were a card that showed up a little earlier in the game, things might look a lot different, because ward and protecting against my spot removal is a very real threat, especially when you can find that bell that you see in your hand.
Yeah, absolutely. Ward is very hard for the Ruby Amethyst deck to deal with. Honestly, it's hard for a lot of decks to deal with. But Ruby Amethyst can really only deal with it with Be Prepared, which I know is a premium card, Ruby Amethyst. But when you face things like Kuzco, like Donald Duck, like Aurora, and you play Ruby Amethyst, you realize pretty quickly how annoying that card can be. But yeah, I mean, I think that for you, it's funny being the hyper control deck, playing the Ruby Amethyst side of this. You are definitely the beatdown in this matchup. Like, you are
Yes.
threatening to win the game. You are the aggressive deck, especially as we get into this ultra late game. And you have these two characters on board, and you can get so close to that critical 20 lore.
Well, and this is why, one of the reasons why I just have really enjoyed my time in Lorcana thus far. And like I said, I haven't played it as much as you have yet. I am still kind of on my journey as it is, but I really enjoy the aspect of like reading the board, reading the sort of the game state itself, and deciding in that moment, making those decisions whether or not you should be playing aggressively. Sort of in some ways opposite of how you built the deck, because the game calls for it. And that's another reason why something like a best of 3 series is so so interesting, because you don't know what you're going into until you've played that first game, and then you have to not necessarily sideboard, but play what you've built differently. And here I established Ursula, forcing a card draw and a lore loss on your side, and then establish a really key card, which is that pocket watch.
Yeah, so the critical combo here is going, especially if you're 18, is you're just gonna the Aladdin with the pocket watch that threatens to win the game if I quest with anything on my board, because it kills everything in my deck, and it will sort of win you game on the spot. At this point, because you're threatening the board so much, I will likely go with the line to just make you have it, because if you don't have it, I will definitely win the game in 2 turns here. So that's, I'm going to have spot removal for the Ursula. I sort of have all the answers except potentially an Aladdin coming down off the back of that and killing something that I've quested with. But I basically have to put you on a clock, because I have removal for this Ursula, But as a Sapphire Steel deck, I don't have infinite removal, right? I can't play it slow and try to quest for 16 on a single turn and completely avoid the Aladdin. That's not a thing, right? I will simply just lose to landing like another Tibbs or just like anything that lands for that quest for 2, because my
Exactly.
deck does not have enough draw and does not have enough removal to deal with a lethal threat every single turn.
No, I think this is the right. That's exactly correct. Once you use your spot removal here, I don't think you can ever consider playing around it. You can't really play to not lose the game. You kind of have to play to win the game. And in that scenario, playing to win the game means questing here and then hoping I don't have the combo we just talked about in Aladdin Pocket Watch, and that is the Shift Aladdin, if you're wondering. And so here going to quest for 4, going up to 8, and establishing or threatening the establishment of 6 more on the board can be very dangerous over the next 2 turns. But unfortunately, I did end up drawing into it off of that final play of the Whole New World and paying for it, and then being able to give that the ability to rush out there and then take out one of your characters does mean that you end up losing 2 lore off the trigger, and I steal 2 lore to close out the game. But while it was this sort of back and forth affair, it was just an incredibly, like, if you know what those decks are doing, it's an incredibly fascinating game and one that's really exciting all the way to the finish.
Yeah, I think that Ruby Amethyst is a very popular deck. A lot of people know what that deck does, are familiar with the play patterns, but I feel like this game was a really good example of what the Sapphire Steel deck can do. Sort of a less, not as much represented deck in the meta, but if you're interested in that combo game plan, you like drawing a lot of your deck, you like popping off, this is the deck for you at that point. I think this is the premier combo deck in Lorcana at this point.
Which is quite exciting because I love combo decks myself, and this is one after I saw you play it, I was like, I really got to give that a shot myself. Well, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this type of content, if you want to see more of this, let us know in the comments below. Tell us what decks you would like to see us play. We will do our best to put a collection together and get you some games out for that. But I don't know. Tell them where we can find you, Brendan.
You can find me on Twitter at BrendanAPG, and then I have a podcast as well, Podcana Podcasts. Probably be a link in the description, but you search on YouTube as well. Every single week we release an episode on Fridays, and me and Kawa talk competitive Lorcana, so level ups, what are the best decks, the best lists, and we have guests on there all the time.
Awesome. Well, as always, everybody, thanks for watching.